Ruttie Jinnah, the woman who stood defiant, is the biography of a remarkable lady, a lady who died in the prime of her youth, beautiful and witty, fiercely anti-colonial, and, and an underexplored personality of the history of 20th century British India. This is the book that is fascinating because of the personality it studies is very fascinating. Um, One of the most underexplored or understudied aspects of the freedom movement is the impact and influence of Mrs. Jinnah, the wife of Muhammad Ali Jinnah, in the creation of Pakistan, and of course in the division of South Asia in 1947. As we all know that the death of Mrs. Jinnah predates the creation of Pakistan. So how exactly did she impact? She definitely did not um, support the idea of Pakistan. For that matter, the word Pakistan was not even coined during her lifetime. Of course, she was not the one who was nudging Muhammad Ali Jinnah towards the idea of separate nationhood for the Muslims. Definitely not. Then how did Mrs. Jinnah impact Pakistan if she did? Now, this book argues, and that's the central theme of this book, that she did so in many indirect ways, even posthumously. Her impact on the freedom movement and on the division of India was more by default than by design, than her own actions or acts of omission or commission. This is something that is very interesting, and how exactly the story goes, I would not divulge here, as I would like the readers to get hold of the book, read it, and find it for themselves. But that is the most interesting takeaway of this biography of Mrs. Jinnah to for anybody interested in the history of the freedom struggle of South Asia, or the direction that politics took after independence. What is important is that Mrs. Jinnah was an influential figure in the history, but why did she remain understudied or underexplored? A lot of brainstorming had gone into the subtitle, "The Woman Who Stood Defiant," um, because this subtitle aptly describes the role Mrs. Jinnah played. She was defined before the colonial authority. For example, the colonial police that symbolized the authority of the imperialist power. She would defy their orders. For example, to disperse when she was leading protests against the establishment of a memorial for an unpopular governor of the Bombay Presidency, Lord Wellington. So neither the threats by the police, nor the use of force by them, nor even the use of water cannons against her and her supporters would make her budge even an inch. He also defied the British viceroys, the highest authority representing the British crown. I can't say that she stood defiant before the viceroys, because I would the most more appropriate word would be she sat defiant before the viceroys, because she was the one who would refuse to stand up when upon the arrival of the viceroy. She would remain seated, and that was her way of showing defiance, by not showing uh, respect to an imperial authority. She stood defiant before her parents when she made a choice whom to marry. That is Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who later became the founder of Pakistan. She was also defiant before the social mores and the societal expectations of a woman at that time, of being a submissive, subdued, or docile individual. She defied the political culture of that time by dressing boldly and daringly. Her dresses were, again, I must hasten to add, daring in the political sense, not in any way in the moral sense. This book is divided into three parts. Part one of the book is about the life of Mrs. Jinnah. It starts with her family origins, both her maternal and paternal parents, grandparents, who are amongst the richest and most influential families of Bombay at that time. Then we talk about her early years, her education, her friend circle, and when she grew up, many of her hobbies. She had a passion for dressing, she had fondness for pets, she was a voracious reader, and then there were many other elitist hobbies that she nurtured, including, for example, horse riding, music, and dancing, etc. When she married to Muhammad Ali Jinnah, she changed her home. She changed his house when she married Mr. Jinnah. So it became a very lively house, full of partying, full of life. Her, tasteful decoration of the drawing room, to her lavish hospitality to all the guests, that made the house of Mr. Jinnah as what some people say a living paradise. The book, that is the first chapter, the first part, which is about her life, then concludes with the final two chapters about her terminal illness and finally her death at the age of 29. And she was suffering from a stomach-related illness for since as early as she was 22, and even when she was 25, the illness had taken a serious turn, and her mother seriously was worried about her daughter's life. She was worrying for her life. And when eventually Mrs. Jinnah died, the otherwise introvert husband, who would Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who would seldom ever show his emotions publicly, broke down into tears and wept like a child when her body was being lowered into the grave. And for the next 1 year, Muhammad Ali Jinnah wore a black band on his left arm as a sign of mourning. And till his last day of his life, he would visit the grave of his wife every Thursday whenever he was in Bombay. And Thursday, by the way, was the day of her death. Mr. Jinnah sometimes would open up the trunks in his attic, in the trunks in which he had kept all the belongings, the jewelry, the saris, the dresses of his late wife, and would look at them for hours and continue sobbing. So that was the personal part of Mrs. Jinnah's life and death. The second part of the book is about the politics of Mrs. Jinnah and her ideologies. It deals with her decision to convert to Islam, why she did so, her devotion to the Sufi tradition within the Islamic religion, her keenness to visit Aligarh Muslim University, etc., etc. Then we move on to the political side, her role in anti uh, Lord Wellington protests, her role in protests against the deportation of the journalist Mr. Horniman, um, and her role in the creation of All India Trade Union Congress, etc. This part also talks about the relations of Mrs. Jinnah with the Gandhis and with Nehrus, as well as with the British administrators. Her political and social activism is also discussed in this second part of the book. For example, feminism probably ran in the blood of Mrs. Jinnah. She had worked a lot for improvement of the conditions of women working in the red light districts of the city of Bombay. She was also an animal rights activist. She worked for the rights of animals in the the province of Bombay, and there was a lot of impact of her work in terms of the legislation that was done for animal protection. Then we come on to part three, and part three of the book, the last part of the book talks about the legacy of Mrs. Jinnah. That includes, for example, her legacy in more mundane things. For example, the Indian blouse that she introduced and became a fashion statement in among the elite circles of Indian women for decades to come. but also a biological legacy through her daughter and onwards through her grandchildren and great grandchildren, and as well as her what should I call infrastructural or architectural legacy through the house she owned, the house that was gifted to her as a wedding gift by her husband, Mohammad Ali Jinnah, and that still stands and is at the center of a heated and fierce diplomatic dispute between Pakistan and India. So we talk also about her imprint on Indian history and Indian freedom movement during the 1920s, and the book then also talks about her um, footprints of her imprint on the direction that Pakistan took post independence. So that was all about the legacy that Mrs. Jinnah left behind uh, in India and Pakistan, but mainly in Pakistan. Uh, this book, this biography, then makes certain revelations, for example, about the linkage between the targets of 26/11 terrorist attacks in 2008 in the city of Mumbai with the life and love of Mr. and Mrs. Jinnah. One of the targets, Taj Mahal, the Taj Hotel, was the place where Mrs. Jinnah actually went on to propose Mr. Jinnah for his hand in marriage, and the Masgaon area where in the Muslim cemetery Mrs. Jinnah is buried and has her last resting place at, which became the targets of the militants who claimed to be um, loyal, let's say, to the cause of what they thought of Muslims or Muslim leadership, and how these places were desecrated with the blood of innocent people. This book is also important because this is the first ever book that would try to see Jinnah's life through the lens or through the prism of his wife. We have so many biographies written about Jinnah himself, and but this is a biography which also explains the life and politics and decisions of Jinnah, not only in 1920s but even beyond, even after the death of his wife, um, through the lens of the life and ideas of his wife, Mrs. Ruttie Jinnah. I think that the greatest contribution of this book is that it brings out a personality that is at least non-controversial within the context of India-Pakistan divide. She is a person, a figure of anti-colonial resistance who can be celebrated equally on both sides of the geographical and political divide. She is one of the persons whom we need to find more about in the interest of building bridges in South Asia, rather than rather than bringing more divisiveness in South Asia. So, with these few words, this brief introduction of the book, Ruttie Jinnah, The Woman Who Stood Defiant, I would ask all of you to consider reading this book. I hope it will add not only to the knowledge of individual readers, but I guess it has already started a new debate on the interpretation of the events that took place in 1910s and 20s in South Asia during the British rule. Thank you. Thank you for listening.